Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Akaka, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not on this vote, the ayes are 42, the nays are 57. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President?
The senator from New York.
I call up my amendment number 2156.
The clerk will report.
The senator from New York, Ms. Gillibrand, proposed amendment 2156.
For the reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that my amendment be modified with the changes that are at the desk.
Is there objection? Without objection. The amendment is so modified.
Let me be clear, Mr. President.
There will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided. Senator from New York.
Let me be clear, Mr. President, about what this amendment does and does not do. This amendment does not extend or expand the food stamp program. It provides the exact same benefits that our families are receiving today. Half of the food stamp beneficiaries are children, 17% are seniors, and unfortunately now 1.5 million households are veteran households that are receiving food stamps. This amendment does not take a penny from our farmers. These cuts are not about waste, fraud, and abuse. According to CBO, it is $90 a month from these families' kitchen tables. We all here in this chamber take the ability to feed our children for granted. That is not the case for too many families in America. Put yourselves for just a moment in their shoes. Imagine being a parent who cannot feed your children the food they need to grow. It's beneath this body to cut food assistance for those who are struggling the most among us.
Time has expired. The senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I must regretfully oppose this amendment.
Senator will come to order.
Thank you.
Senator
I deeply care about protecting nutrition assistance programs. I hope that that is not in doubt. But here's what's going on. In a handful of states, they found a way to increase the SNAP benefits for people in their states by sending $1 checks and heating assistance to everyone who gets food assistance. Now, it's important to consider what a family's heating bill is when determining how much help they need, which is why the two programs are linked. But sending out $1 checks to everyone isn't the intent of Congress. For the small number of states that are doing that, it is undermining the integrity of the program, in my judgment. I appreciate we have turned down those amendments that would, in fact, change the structure and lower benefits. But this is about accountability and integrity within the program, and I must oppose the amendment.
The question is, The Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I strongly oppose this amendment. This amendment would shield over 82% of Farm Bill spending from deficit reduction and prevent the bill from addressing a serious breach in nutrition program integrity. Let me be clear. Tightening the LIHEAP loophole does not affect SNAP eligibility for anyone using SNAP. To add insult to this injury, this amendment then pillages money
The
from
time
crop
has
insurance.
expired. The Senator's time has expired.
Did we not have a minute apiece?
I would ask the President if there's any time remaining in the debate.
All debate time has expired.
Well, we'll stop at pillaging.
Mr. President, I would ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Gotcha. Mr. Baucus.
No. No.
Blumenthal. Gotcha. I did. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt. Sure. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons.
He just made a fatal mistake. He said, this kills the bill.
Mr. Corker.
Aye.
Mr. Graham.
Oh, my God, I'm waiting for you.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin.
You need to go talk to your buddies over there.
Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan.
I haven't known what I've been doing for an hour. I'm just getting...
Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain,
Not yet.
Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb,
I'm a no.
Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Kerry, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Lieberman, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murray, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, and Wyden. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Lee. Mr. McCain. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Dement. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Senators voting in the negative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Baucus, Bennett, Bingaman, Blunt, Bozeman, Collins, Conrad, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Dement, Durbin, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Kyle, Landrieu, Lee, Lugar, Manchin, McCain, Nelson of Nebraska, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Tester, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Vitter, Warner, Webb, and Wicker. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, no. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, no. Kaka. Mr. Kaka. Mr. Kaka, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, no. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye.
Okay.
And Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, no. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, no. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul, no. Ms. Snow? Ms. Snow? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not on this vote, the ayes are 33, the nays are 66. The amendment is not agreed to.
Turned it in already? Mr. President? Mr. President?
The Majority Leader.
We've done very well today. We have 2.5 pages. We almost have a page finished of our amendments. We're going to tonight have 2 hours of the time set forth for the resolution disapproval, 2 hours of debate tonight. That will start at 10 to 8 tonight or thereabouts. One of the senators agreed to take a voice vote. That saved us 15 minutes, so we gave him 10 minutes off earlier. So if everyone would take a look at these amendments, we have to finish this bill and flood insurance this week. We have to do that. And I don't want to be crying wolf. We're going to be here Friday. I hope we don't, we need to finish our work. We can do that. People have been here. We've actually finished some of our votes before the time has expired. And that's really difficult. The floor staff has a difficult time recapping the votes and doing that, but everyone's done such a good job. I would hope also one of the things that we could look at is that Boxer and Inhofe could look at giving back at least an hour of the time of debate. I think virtually everybody knows how they're going to vote on this issue, although their debate could be stunning and somebody could change, but I doubt it. So if they could consider giving back an hour of their time out of the 4 hours, I think it would help us work through this stuff. I don't want to have to be here till 2 o'clock Thursday morning. I don't want to do that. I hope that we can work through this so we have just a limited amount of morning business tomorrow. We're going to start voting as soon as we can and move quickly like we have today. So, but everyone take a look at their amendment and see if they would be willing to take it by voice. It all looks the same when it's all over with. So we're going to stop voting tonight about 10 to 8.
President,
The senator from South Carolina is recognized.
I call up demand amendment 2263.
The clerk will report.
The senator from South Carolina, Mr. Dement, proposed amendment number 2263.
Thank you, Mr. President.
There'll now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided. The Senate will come to order. The senator from South Carolina.
The President's 2013 budget asked for about $9 million for the rural utility service to expand broadband services in rural areas. The average over the last 10 years of spending for that service is about $14 million. The current level of spending is at $25 million. So if anything, given our $16 trillion in debt, you would think we would come in somewhat below that. But the Farm Bill doubles our current level from $25 million to $50 million. My amendment keeps spending at $25 million level. That's the least we can do, given the President has asked for 9. The average is 14. We're at 25. We at least need to keep it there. I encourage my colleagues to have a brief moment of fiscal sanity and vote for my amendment. I yield back.
Mr. President.
The senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I rise to oppose the amendment that would cut funding for critical program for small businesses in rural communities across the country. You know, in the 1930s and 40s, we made a commitment to rural electrification, extended what was a fairly new technology to communities across the country, and we had a boon in innovation and economic growth. And our country no longer has a divide between urban haves and rural have-nots as a result of that. Well, today the Internet is the new dividing line. Too many communities still don't have access to high-speed broadband Internet. For businesses in these locations, it's a real competitive disadvantage for them, especially in a global economy. I would urge that we support what we've done to invest in small businesses and the ability to connect. We do not need the new urban haves and rural have-nots. This is about investing in rural communities.
The senator's time has expired. The question is on the amendment.
I would ask, well,
Where is Gary?
we'll wait.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus.
One vote yes. No.
Oh, come on,
Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett.
No.
Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Brown of Massachusetts, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Dement, Enzi, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, Paul, Portman, Roberts, Sessions, Thune, and Vitter. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Harkin, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, McCaskill, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kerry, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, no. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Carper, no.
To cast a vote. If not, on the Dominion Amendment, the ayes are 45, the nays are 54. The amendment fails.
Mr. President,
Senator from North Carolina.
I call up my amendment number 2366.
The clerk will report.
Senator from North Carolina, Mrs. Hagan, proposes an amendment number 2366.
I ask that further reading be dispensed with.
Without objection. There will be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided.
Mr. President,
Senator from North Carolina. Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, the Senate is not in order, and the senator has a very common sense amendment.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator from North
President.
Carolina.
As everyone knows, federal crop insurance policies are extremely technical and complex. My amendment seeks to give farmers additional access to clear, concise information about crop insurance policies and programs approved by the USDA. This common sense amendment seeks to accomplish this goal in 2 ways. First, it will require the Secretary of Agriculture to report back to Congress on the status of the agency's effort to comply with the President's executive order to require the use of plain language. My hope is that this simple measure will force USDA to move quickly to provide information necessary for our farmers in North Carolina and other parts of the country to make informed decisions about signing up for the crop insurance plans that meet their specific needs. Second, my amendment requires the Risk Management Agency to improve its existing website so that agricultural producers in any state may access easily understandable information on crop insurance. The website
The
will
senator's
provide...
time has expired.
I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment.
Who yields time?
And
Senator from Michigan.
on behalf of the ranking member and myself, we would yield back time, and it's my understanding we can proceed with a voice vote on this amendment.
Hearing no further debate on the amendment, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. President,
The senator from South Carolina.
I'd like to bring up amendment number 2262.
The clerk will report.
Senator from South Carolina, Mr. Dement, proposes an amendment number 2262.
This amendment is
There will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Thank you, Mr. President. This amendment is a sense of the Senate that reflects what all of us talk about, not just with the Farm Bill, but with the whole U.S. economy, the importance of the free market, letting our competitive system work. This bill would just say that nothing, or my amendment says that nothing in the Farm Bill would interfere with the free market by setting prices or doing anything that I think all of the proponents of the bill say that it will do, that it will protect the free market. So it's just a sense of the Senate, and I've agreed to a voice vote on this, but I encourage my colleagues to add their voice to the free market system and support this amendment.
Mr. President,
Senator from Michigan.
on behalf of the ranking member and myself, we would yield back all time, and we will agree to a voice vote.
Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 2187.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Massachusetts, Mr. Kerry, proposes an amendment number 2187.
Now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Can we have order?
Senate will come to order.
Mr. President, this is an amendment on behalf of myself and Senator Murkowski, Senator Brown, and others. In these very difficult economic times, we've also had a problem for the fishermen of the Northeast and in other parts of the country, where the fishing stocks have been greatly reduced for a lot of different reasons. And a lot of fishermen are sitting there with their boats where they're trying to get through the season in order to be able to fish in the future with greatly restricted fishing capacity and availability. This is not unlike farmers who wind up with crops being affected, flood, other disasters, things that take place. All we are seeking for here is the ability of doing away with an inequity in the law that denies fishermen access to a loan under federal emergency loan standards for an emergency when it arises and they need to have some ability to stay over. So we want to provide them. The Congressional Budget Office determines that this amendment has no score. There is no score. So commercial fishermen, we believe, deserve access to the same type of assistance that other commercial farmers and other people in this country get, and we hope colleagues will do away with this anomaly that denies them the ability to simply apply through normal standards for a loan.
Senator from Michigan.
We would yield back all time and understand we can proceed with the voice vote.
Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. President,
The senator from South Carolina.
I'd like to call up amendment 2268.
The clerk will report.
Senator from South Carolina, Mr. Dement, proposes an amendment number 2268.
There will now be 2 minutes of time, debate equally divided between both sides. 1 minute each.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm tempted to try another voice vote since the last one worked so well, but I think we'll have the yeas and nays on this one. This amendment just says that as all of us look at some of the loan guarantees, like with Solyndra, that have gone bad, this amendment would prohibit loan guarantees for the Farm Bill, that there are many programs that guarantee the loans that expose the American taxpayers for millions and millions of dollars. This bill would actually prohibit those guarantees, not prohibit the programs themselves and crop insurance and the things that farmers count on, but just the liability that we put on the American taxpayer. Loan guarantees do cost the taxpayer money. CBO says that it does, so I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment and save the American taxpayers from this additional liability.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I do rise to oppose this amendment. USDA loan guarantees are critical to our farmers, our rural small businesses, community banks in small towns across the country. The loan guarantee programs help support commercial and farm credit lending when farmers and ranchers face tough times. It's also an important program to help beginning farmers and ranchers who don't have a long history of credit, but who are certainly qualified to receive loans to start their operations. We know that the average age of an American farmer is 57 years of age, and that 1/4 of our farmers are 65 years of age or older. If agriculture in America is going to survive, we need to have young people engaged in farming. This amendment would make it much, much harder. So I oppose the amendment.
The question is on the amendment.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There's a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Thank you. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Noe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Hatch. Ms. Menendez. Mr. Carper. Mr. Webb. Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative. Ayotte, Coburn, DeMint, Graham, Inhofe, Johnson, Wisconsin, McCain, Paul, Rubio, and Toomey. Senators voting in the negative. Alexander, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Lugar, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Nelson of Florida, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Kerry, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. I do not, sir. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mr. Coates? Mr. Coates, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Sessions, no. It was aye. Mr. Kaka. Mr. Kaka, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Noway, no. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Nelson, Nebraska, no. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Thune, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mrs. Hutchison, no. Ms. Snow, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Corker, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Pryor, no.
Senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 14, the noes are 84. The amendment is not agreed to. Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I'd like to call up
Senator,
amendment.
suspend. Senate's not in order. Senate will be in order.
I'd like to call up Amendment 2321.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Louisiana, Ms. Landrieu, proposes amendment number 20.